Good morning, everyone. As you know, my name's Steve Pinto, and we're running these Wandsworth Coronavirus Business Forums for, 11 weeks now. This is an opportunity for businesses to have their say. We've been very fortunate to have Wandsworth Council supporting this forum since the start. It's been an extremely difficult period, I guess, for all of us. From our point of view, the Chamber is now down to just me running it. And I guess I have to make an apology to everyone. If I haven't answered your emails, it's simply because there are just hundreds sitting in the inbox and I am trying to get through to them. And just lately we're trying to develop a new system that will give businesses a huge digital advantage, because everything is going to be digital shortly. Publishing the new edition of Business Connections, our quarterly magazine, so there have been huge deadlines there. So if you have submitted a question to me or asked for some help and I haven't responded, I do apologize, but please just send it again and again, and I will get to it as best I can. So today we have Mr. Paul Martin, who's the Chief Executive of Wandsworth Council, who will be giving us a rounded view on what's happening in Wandsworth, and an awful lot has been happening lately. We'll then have Graham Russell, who's the Assistant Director of Resources at Wandsworth Council, and Graham will be talking to us about the discretionary grant fund, which has just been launched, and businesses are already making applications. So more on that from Graham in just a moment. Our guest speakers this week are Kizzy Austin, who's a partner at Russell Cook, who specialises in health and safety matters. Kizzy will be talking about a lot of the things that are absolutely crucial and relevant as we go into recovery around the law and what we really need to do. David Mellard from Bedrock HR will be talking about some practical steps to help businesses to plan for recovery, and delivering a very interesting case study to help people understand the importance of getting all the processes right when you're dealing with staff and customers. We have a surprise guest speaker for you as well, who's Dexter Moscow. Dexter's a very popular presenter, business coach and author. Dexter will be talking about how you can make the most of Zoom through conferencing and through video presentations. We also have Zaid from Lanup Accountants and Martin Pocock, who's an insolvency business advisor on the panel, and they're here to answer your questions. We take the positive spin on insolvency, and it's more about helping businesses to keep going, really, to persevere rather than to wind up, and Martin's an expert in that. So that is enough from me. I'm now going to ask Mr. Paul Martin to unmute himself and address you. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. So let me just check that everybody can hear me. Maybe give me a bit of a nod, Steve, just to indicate that I'm speaking clearly. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you again. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And let me say that for the Wandsworth Council, we're very appreciative of everything that the Chamber does to help us with this dialogue between the council and our businesses, you know, this very challenging time. So thank you for everything you're doing. And colleagues, you probably know that on participating in this meeting as well from Wandsworth Council is Graham Russell, who's the Assistant Director in our Resources Department, responsible for overseeing the disbursement of the funds that we're handling on the government's behalf. And I think Graham's going to be speaking after me, particularly about the discretionary fund, which has recently been announced, and Wandsworth Council's approach to handling applications for that. So it's great that Graham has again joined us, and also Steve Diamond, who many of you will know is the Head of Economic Development at Wandsworth Council. So we're here to both to hopefully provide relevant information and to answer any questions that we can. If we can't, then get back to you subsequently. Now, in terms of what I'm going to cover, I'll just try and provide a sort of an overview of some of the things that are on my mind at the moment, and some of the things that I'm hearing as the chief executive of the council, I thought that would be most helpful. And you can see probably from my background, tragically, I don't live in a wood-panelled home, but I am in my office in Wandsworth Town Hall. And I guess for many of you businesses, you're doing a little bit of what I'm doing and my colleagues are doing here at the Town Hall and in our other council premises. That is getting them ready for reactivation. As with all businesses and service organisations, we know that we need to prepare our premises for a different kind of reality that we're returning to. And so as I kind of wander around the corridors of the town hall here, it's a different sort of place to how it's been before. We've got a different cleaning regime in place now. Probably more is going to be said, isn't it, during the course of this event, about making your premises right for customers and staff returning. So here we've got a new cleaning regime. We've got new signage, with the social distancing rules around everywhere. So that looks very different. We've got screens that we didn't used to have. We've got hand sanitizers around everywhere. A little bit of this, actually, I look around me and think a lot of these things are probably improvements and maybe things that we possibly should always have had rather more than we have in the past. So we're doing everything that we can to get our premises as ready as they can be for our staff and our visitors and our customers. The government advice, of course, remains for all of those people who can work from home to continue to work from home. And that's what I'm saying to our staff, and I'm sure that's what you as businesses are saying to your teams as well, that if you can work from home, and most of our staff can, you should continue to work from home. And it's not clear to me when that advice will change. And it's even crossed my mind, will it ever change? So will there ever be a point where the government says, if you can work from home, you should actually go into work? Will that ever change? I don't know. And we know in the weeks ahead, the reactivation of businesses and the timetable for that happening. We know for the most part, but we don't know, I think, for every type of business, but we know for the most part how that's being scheduled. But for those large numbers of staff who work in offices and who are able to work from home, what the guidance to them is, we're not certain. And so where I'm heading really on this is, I've started to realise how important it is to reinstall a sense of confidence on the part of everyone, of our wider community, our staff and residents more generally, a sense of confidence that it is safe to go out and safe to come into work. And it's taken me a little while to realise that that's going to take some time. That it won't be like flicking a switch, that people were staying at home and now we flick the switch and they now are confident to come in and confident to resume life as normal. I think it is going to be a more gradual process than that. And I've started to realise that that's going to mean that, for those of us in the position of being employers or senior leaders, we've got to have a long-term approach. We've got to be, I think, patient. We have to be show sort of careful work and demonstrating what we're doing, that we are making it safe to be out and about and to resume life a little bit more as normal. And we need to show leadership in the way that we work. That's a good and appropriate thing to do. So, as I say, I think that for me and I think my colleagues, we've realised that this is going to be a long-term process, and that we need to be patient and listen to our residents and our staff. And that's particularly true, and you touched on this, Steve, interestingly, in your opening presentation, your opening words, for people from the BAME community, where there's been a particular level of concern, as we've all seen in the TV news and all of the news reports in recent days and weeks. And there have been a variety of points that this has come from. Obviously, the terrible events in the States and the murder of George Floyd, you know, that's had a not just a massive impact in the United States, but it's had an international repercussions. And it's been felt very profoundly by many people from BAME communities. And it's sort of come together with greater anxieties about COVID-19, about what we now know is the disproportionate impact of coronavirus on people from BAME communities. There's been a Public Health England report about this, which has identified particular communities, particularly, for example, people of Bangladeshi heritage, but others as well, who are more at risk from the virus and dying from the virus. And of course, there are other inequalities that were always felt that have been crystallized more in recent weeks. And if I say that we're just coming up now to the 3rd anniversary of the Grenfell fire, the Grenfell disaster, and that in itself was a moment when many people in BAME communities, you know, highlighted for them their greater vulnerability and concerns about their place in the community. So the reason I say all of that is that I think that feelings of risk and vulnerability are widespread in the community. And they're felt perhaps more by some people than others. And we're very conscious in the council that we need to be alert to those concerns, empathetic towards them. We do what we can, everything that we can, to try to listen to and to reflect our sensitivity, awareness to those concerns. For example, by illuminating the town hall purple in memory of George Floyd, which we did at a point last week, and possibly that will have a resonance for many of you as business leaders in your various roles as employers and also providing a service to the community. I wanted to say something about our emerging sort of understanding of what the macro impact on the economy might be of the pandemic. And you know, many of you will be much better informed than I am of what the economic impact might be, both short, medium, longer term. We need to keep an eye on that. I guess the thing I wanted to particularly emphasise, thinking about this trend of working from home and the movement away from working in head offices, is thinking about what that will mean for Wandsworth. And I'm really interested in what everybody in this meeting thinks about what impact that's going to have on Wandsworth. So just to try to unpack what I mean by that. So I was talking to somebody in a shop the other day who said that his son works in the city, and he said that he works in an IT company in the city, and he said at the moment they're on 3 floors, and he said they've given notice to their landlord they want to move out of 2 of those floors and just keep this, you know, now just occupy 1. They're issuing new contracts to all of their staff, including this guy's son, to say that from now you're working from home 3 days a week, because they realise that this is a business model that they can endorse and work with long term. And so that's a story I heard, and I've heard many other stories like that. I just mentioned that one, many others like that. So what will the cumulated effect be if many more companies are saying we can do a lot of our business long term working from home, and they're decommissioning head offices? What's going to be the long term effect of that for Wandsworth? And of course, we can't be certain. In some ways, part of Wandsworth's strategic advantage is its geographical proximity to major company headquarters, particularly in the city. So that's definitely part of our appeal as a destination, as a place to live. So that might worry us possibly a little bit longer term. But on the other hand, Wandsworth is also, and perhaps most of all, a very high quality residential borough, with very attractive parks and open spaces and a good choice of housing stock and very good schools So fundamentally, a great place to live. And so there might be a bit of a mixed impact. Perhaps on balance, it might benefit us if more people are spending a greater amount of time at home, because they might be out and about in town centres a little bit more likely to shop and use use local facilities in a greater proportion of the week than they currently do. So we're not certain, and it'll be a mixed impact, of course. But I think on balance, we could be quite well placed in Wandsworth on that. And I do think that for the council, we need to concentrate a lot on livability and quality of life. And that is what the members are thinking about. So if I just give a few examples of that in practice, we had last night a strategic planning and transportation overview and scrutiny committee. It was, in our new world, a virtual meeting, very much like this. So councillors, together with some members of the public, came together to look, amongst other things, about how our road space should be re-evaluated in this context. So the apportionment of road space for cars and for pedestrians and cyclists. What does coronavirus mean very short term and longer term for that? And we're looking at different options of how we might review the use of road space. It's always going to be a balance and a compromise, and always people will have different perspectives. Businesses have different perspectives, and we'll try to do our best to listen to every point of view. We're thinking, for example, about the reactivation of the hospitality industry, about al fresco dining and drinking, and how we might help people participate in hospitality industries outdoors, what that might mean for street closures in some places. So all of these things are very much on our agenda. And more widely, we're looking at our economic development strategy. As you'd expect, Steve Diamond, as our head of economic development, is very close to this. So we're looking both very short term in some of the measures that I've talked about, making sure that we're financially supporting businesses in every way we can, but also in the weeks and months ahead, looking at everything that a council can do to try to support the business community and to accelerate some of our long-term goals, especially around climate change. So the council had published, I think, a generally well-regarded strategy on climate change not long before the pandemic struck. So what we now want to do is to say that remains incredibly important to us. Which elements of that might even be accelerated as a result of coronavirus? So there might be some areas could be difficult, but there might be some areas that I'm thinking, for example, about improvements to air quality, which could be which we could make even greater progress in quickly as a consequence of this. So high street reactivation is very much on our agenda at the moment. We're very aware that we're dependent on each other in this situation, that for the council to succeed, businesses must succeed too. So the changes that I'm talking about, we want to work as closely as we possibly can with all of the interest groups, our businesses and residents and communities more generally. We're dependent upon each other. And I want to conclude just by saying how appreciative we are of at this very, very difficult time. I know for businesses, challenging and a lot of anxiety about standard of living and employment prospects and trade going forward. But we're very appreciative of all of the dialogue and responses that we've had, and we'll do our best to work as closely as we can with you in the different set of challenges that we're now coming into as we get more thoroughly into business reactivation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. For me, with Wandsworth Chamber, we've been involved with the council for many, many years. And one of the things that strikes me is that, I've sat on steering groups and committees where you're planning 10 years in advance for what an area might look at or how developments will interact. But now we've got a pandemic situation and so many things happening. How is the council adapting to this much quicker decision-making process and fitting that into the overall strategy? Has the overall strategy changed?
Well, I think that because so much has changed so quickly, we just need to talk a lot about what this means for us. So, I'll give an example. I talked about home working. So how far should we be saying to our staff, we actually want you to come back into the town hall and work here, even if you're able to work from home. How far should we be leading that process, or should we really accept and embrace the fact that we are moving into a different kind of business and service model going forward? So if I just use that as an example, there will be different views amongst councillors and amongst staff. So I think that what we're doing at the moment is to try to respond efficiently to the day-by-day demands on us in areas like the one that Graham is about to talk about, the application for funding support and paying it out. So, do as well as we can in being efficient in providing our services, but try to engage and talk a lot about what this might mean for us and our communities longer term. So, because no one person has a monopoly of wisdom on that. So, I think that dialogue is more important now than ever.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. Graham, can I invite you to unmute yourself and give us an update on the implementation process of grants, and especially the discretionary grant rollout?
Indeed. Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
First thing I have to say is that my next door neighbour has been furloughed and he's renovating his windows using an electric sander. So if you suddenly hear an awful whining noise, it's not me, it's him. So I'll start with the old grant scheme first, just a regular update on that. So far we've paid out 3,270 of those, totalling just under £51.2 million. We had quite a few new ones come through this week. So as I say every week, if you do know anybody who hasn't applied for that, those schemes remain open. And if they're eligible, they can still apply. Moving on to the discretionary grant scheme, that went live last Friday. The application for that is via the council's website only. If it's okay with you, Steve, I'm going to email you the link and ask you to email it around to everybody, because it'll take me ages to type it into the chat box, if that's all right. So brief background to the scheme. £2.9 million to divide up amongst something approaching 14,000 businesses which we believe to exist in Wandsworth, which haven't had one of the other grants. So as Councillor Cook said last week, it's a virtually impossible task to prioritise those in a way which is going to satisfy anybody, quite frankly. So the council chose to stick with the government's recommendations as to the priority areas for the scheme, which is basically regular market traders, businesses operating in shared spaces who don't pay business rates. There's some help for charities and bed and breakfast that pay council tax rather than business rates. So they're the four main categories that the government recommended, and they are the basis of the Wandsworth scheme. We've had so far 127 applications as of last night. I've got no real idea if that's good, bad, indifferent. We're working in the dark here. We just don't hold the information on the various businesses which are operating within the borough. What I would say is, if you are thinking of applying, you will need to have copies of your property cost agreement, so a rental agreement, a tenancy agreement, something like that, because we are asking for details of property costs, and you will need to upload some documents which support the view that you have lost money because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we'd be looking, management accounts, a letter from your accountant, something like that. So those are the kind of requirements. So the form's online. As you go through, if we've tried to make it as straightforward as possible, so you can apply under each category, and if you come to a question and you put in a certain answer, which means you're ineligible, you will be told at that point that you are ineligible. Once the closing date comes, which will be, we're open for 10 days from last Friday. Once we've gone through all that process, we will be looking at the applications. We're looking at them as we go along, and in the light of the experience of how many people apply, what types of businesses apply, the council will then decide on the allocation criteria and pay out the grants. So it's all a little bit up in the air at the moment, because the whole scheme has been developed really in the dark in terms of us not having the detailed knowledge of all the businesses that are operating within the borough. So I'll email the link to Steve and ask him to distribute that to everybody, and I'll be very happy to try and answer any questions about the scheme that anybody might have. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much, Graham. Yeah, if you could email me that now, I'll try and cut and paste it into the chat box. That would be great.
I've just done that.
Yeah, the closing date is the 18th of June, am I correct?
Yes, that's correct, I think.
Okay, and I'm also presuming then that the grants won't be paid out before that date. You're going to wait for all the applications to come in?
That's correct, because we couldn't specify an amount because we might run out of money before the closing date, and we didn't think it was reasonable to adopt a first come first serve approach. Yeah,
no, that's great, Graham. We'll do our very best to publicise that, and I'd ask everyone to help with publicising that discretionary grant application process. Thank you, Graham. I'm now going to ask Kizzy Austin, who's a partner with Russell Cook, and Russell Cook are patron members of Wandsworth Chamber and help us to provide these services for businesses. Kizzy's a specialist in health and safety matters, and in our pre-discussions he said, it's interesting now because before no one wanted to talk to me, but now everyone wants to talk to me because this is extremely important. Health and safety is law, and our obligations are immense. And in this presentation, Kizzy will cover legal obligations of employers and employees during the COVID-19 pandemic, the reporting of COVID-19 related incidents and potential implications if employees develop symptoms or contract the virus, employee mental health and well-being while working from home, and some top tips for returning to work safely and in line with government guidance. So with that, Kizzy, can I ask you to unmute yourself and share with us?
I will do, thanks. If you can hear me all right, give me a thumbs up or something.
Yeah.
I was just starting off by apologising because I have had to move from my house to the car, the haven of my car, because it's actually quieter in my car. I've got 2 children at home who will be shouting mum, mum, mum in the background. So hopefully over the next 20 minutes, I'll be able to properly provide some information to you guys that will hopefully be helpful to you as businesses and duty holders under health and safety. And Steve was helpfully saying my job has never more been so popular because of COVID-19 and the support that we are giving businesses, particularly from a proactive and preventative stage in terms of the risks that have been posed by COVID. I think we've all been exposed to some sort of risk in terms of how the likes of COVID-19 and the virus have been affecting our ability to carry on with our day-to-day activities as part of our businesses. What COVID hasn't done is have created new obligations. It has reminded us of what we have to do as employers, as occupiers of buildings, and as general duty holders under the health and safety legislation. So I want to just remind everybody of it, and I am going to whistle stop through quite a lot of the items that Steve mentioned at the beginning. But if you do have any follow-up questions, then by all means put it in the chat or come back to us at a later date. So by way of reminder, everybody has an obligation as an employer or as an owner or an occupier of a building to look after the health and safety and welfare of its employees. Not just employees, but also non-employees. So by that, I mean visitors, I mean agency workers, volunteers. It's pretty much, you name it, you have a duty to look after them, albeit it's caveated by this doing what is reasonable in the circumstances. It's doing what's so far as reasonably practicable. So it's not doing everything possible to avoid risk. It is doing what is reasonable in the circumstances, and that might be by way of a cost-benefit analysis. But what's really important to the whole of health and safety, including now at this crucial time of COVID-19, is looking at risk. Once upon a time, we used to look at health and safety as being, slips and trips and falls, and how do we protect our employees or even non-employees from hurting themselves. I think the virus and the impact of the virus on businesses as a whole has brought home to us that it isn't really about physical injury. Health and safety is very much about an assessment of risk and guarding against risk. And that has never been so much borne out by way of some of the cases that have come to court in the recent years, where there is very much a focus on, have you exposed your employees and non-employees to risk, as opposed to have they hurt themselves? So that's what we need to remember as a business, as an organisation. What we also have to remember is that it's not only a business obligation, there are also individual obligations as well. The likes of myself and probably everybody on the call has their own obligations as an individual to look after their own health and safety, and also to comply with whatever needs to be done to ensure that their employers are complying with that overarching responsibility to look after the health and safety of employees and non-employees. But not only that, if you are senior in your organisation and you have any responsibility over the management of activities, the finances, supervision, monitoring, etc., you also may fall into the bracket of being a senior manager or director, regardless of how much you get paid. But you may well have an obligation as a senior manager or a director. And what that means is, if a failure, a health and safety failing, has been committed by that individual by way of consent, connivance, or attributable to the neglect of that person, and by neglect we do mean you should have known about a failing but you've done nothing about it, even if you say I didn't know, it's not enough. That will be classed as neglect, and if that's the case, then yourself as well as an organisation be guilty of a health and safety offence. Now, as I say, none of these things are new. These are existing obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Some of you will be very familiar with those obligations, and they apply very much in this COVID-19 era. What I think has been pushed very much for employers to get hold of and understand very quickly is the relevance of a risk assessment and what it should look like, what it should cover, and do you need a separate risk assessment that deals with the risks from the virus, or can you just incorporate it into your existing risk assessment? The advice I've been giving so far has been you should have a separate risk assessment that deals with viruses, particularly this virus. But there is a requirement to make sure that you have got a suitable and sufficient risk assessment in place to address the risks posed by a particular issue. In this case, it will be the contraction of the virus or the disease and the impact to the workforce once that and if that applies. Now, you've got to have appropriate arrangements in place to ensure that you're planning, organising, controlling, monitoring and reviewing the activities that you perform as part of your day-to-day activities in your business. Now, again, I say employers are not expected to eliminate all risk from their workplace, but what they are expected to do is to protect as many people as possible, weighing up the risk involved as well as the trouble it will take to implement new measures, the time it will take, and the financial considerations in implementation of preventative measures. So that's that cost benefit analysis. So I think just to prepare people to come back to work, you have to have your risk assessments, you need to have an up-to-date health and safety policy, and you also have to make sure that you've got suitable arrangements in place to facilitate the return to work if that is what you as a business is planning to do. Now, the reporting of incidents. This has been a bit of a controversial matter because there have always been obligations to report certain incidents to enforcing authorities, most definitely the health and safety executive, under the reporting regulations. Now, for COVID-19, the HSE, Health and Safety Executive, have been quite specific about what should and can be reported to them as an authority. The first one is an unintended incident at work, which has led to someone's potential or actual exposure to the virus. In that case, we do tend to focus on lab workers who perhaps have smashed a vial and then they've been exposed to a virus, or they've been exposed to material that could cause the risk of them contracting the virus. That's not that common. What's more common is an employee or a worker who's been diagnosed as having COVID-19, and then there is reasonable evidence to show that that was caused by exposure at work. And
need to be in place there. There has to be a medical diagnosis of COVID-19. It's not enough to just simply say, I think I've got symptoms and I'm at work, therefore this should be reported to the authorities. It has to be a medical diagnosis, and it has to be a reasonable suspicion that as a result of your work activity, that employee has been exposed to
the virus. That can be quite difficult to determine, but it is something that you do need to think about, because what we've seen in the last probably 6 to 7 weeks is that there's been a huge increase in the amount of reporting, anonymous reporting, I'll say it that, anonymous reporting to the HSE in terms of suspected cases of COVID-19. Now, does that mean that the business is going to be prosecuted? No, it just simply means that the businesses may be investigated as a result of the report being made. But if you have your measures in place, if you have your risk assessments, if you have engaged with the workforce, which I'll come to in a moment, then you're less likely to have the investigation escalate into any sort of enforcement action or prosecution. And that's what I think we're all here to do, is to discuss those issues and help from a preventative point of view to ensure that you are not placed in a position where you could face scrutiny from the enforcing authorities. The third incident that you have to report to the authorities is if a worker dies as a result of occupational exposure to coronavirus. Again, that's probably a bit more straightforward to deal with. And the latter two are the most common, generally within a healthcare situation, property management, construction. And as I say, having the COVID symptoms is not enough. There has to be medical diagnosis, and there has to be a reasonable suspicion that that employee has been exposed to the potential of contracting the virus. Remote working. Sorry, I'm just firing out headings because these are some things that I think people in the business sector should be thinking about. Steve talked a little bit about remote working as we started, and I think so Paul, it's a great thing, actually. Despite my reluctance to be at home and work at home, many are doing it routinely. I think when we started with the lockdown, it was deemed to be more of a temporary measure, but I think as time has gone on, remote working is now becoming more of the norm. And what we need to think about is, as employers and business owners, what do we need to do to ensure that our employees are being looked after while they're at home? They're not physically in the office, they're not perhaps in an environment that they are particularly used to, and some of them are going to be on their own. So there are lots of things to factor in. Do you have to have a separate display screen equipment assessment, a DSE assessment? If it's temporary working, no. If it's looking like it's more permanent, we really don't know what the definition of temporary is, but I would say more than a few weeks would count as more permanent, and therefore requires a separate assessment of the DSE equipment and workstation for your employees. Now, the government has been clear. Workers should continue to work at home where
the onus really is on the employer to say, if you can work at home, do work at home. What I've had from some employees is that they feel the onus has been the other way around. Employers have been saying, come in if you can, and that's obviously not the right way to go. The way in which you probably temper some of the perhaps worried or anxiety type feelings that employees might have about coming back
is to engage with them. So if you start engaging with the workforce early, which I presume a lot of you have already done, then you'll probably get them more on board when it comes to physically having them back in the office. But it is something to think about. How do you communicate with your workforce while they're at home? How much support do you give them? As I say, working at home isn't a new concept. It's something that lots of people do, but they do need to be equipped with the tools and the support that they need to enable them to do their job. Another factor to think about when it comes to remote working is people's mental health and well-being. I think for the last 3 or 4 years, mental health and well-being has been a huge part of general health and safety for workplaces. I think if you don't have specific policies in place to deal with mental health, well-being and stress, if you don't engage with your workforce and have a proactive, preventative approach to securing the mental health of your workforce, that can be used against you if there was deemed to be a health and safety failing or an incident that was caused as a result of the impact of a person's mental health or stress or well-being. The reason I say that is because the sentencing guidelines that they use when a company is being sentenced for a health and safety failing focuses on risk, not physical injury. And there has been some talk about making more of occupational health and how you deal with occupational health surveillance, what you do with the results, etc., etc. So they want to see businesses being much more proactive and robust about the way in which they deal with mental health and well-being. And it's not just the softer side of health and safety. It's much more important, to the point where the HSE have said, if we notice that there is a number of employees that are suffering from mental health issues or well-being issues in the workplace, they will use that as a springboard to investigate businesses more often. So that's a very clear message, I think, from the HSE. Just to round up, and we've talked a little bit about some of the issues that have come up in recent weeks for organisations. If you've listened to nothing so far, I'd say the next 5 minutes really is about the top tips to think about when you are having the workforce return to work. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, think about how you are following the government guidance, the 5-step approach, as well as industry standards. The 5-step approach deals with things like having a risk assessment, making sure you've got your hygiene procedures in place, the deep cleaning, the hand washing, etc. Looking at your engagement with the workforce and making sure that you're helping people to work at home. Maintaining your social distancing, of course, and where you can't maintain social distancing, making sure that you're managing the transmission risk. And by that,
activities are kept as short as possible, having screens and barriers, phased working, you name it. If it applies to your type of business and your type of work, then you should be thinking about how best to manage the transmission risk if you cannot socially distance. So it goes without saying, follow the government guidance. It isn't law, but it goes a long way to convincing a court, if you found yourself in an unfortunate position of being prosecuted for failing to secure health and safety of
your staff, it goes a long way to complying with the law. I talked about engaging with the workforce. It's really important. health and safety, again, the themes that have come up in recent years has all been about collaboration and cooperation and consultation. And that comes a lot from the construction sector, who in a lot of ways, some people said they got it right. You know, they stopped work quite early. They've had a lot to say about the way in which they're phasing people back into work. And now they've started the economy going again with managing buildings and building buildings. So construction sector do a lot in terms of the high risk environment they work in, and they put a lot of things in place. For example, they speak a lot about collaboration being important. I'd said about engaging with the workforce, and again, using the lessons from the construction sector, really, really good to engage with the workforce and get them on board at an early stage so they can help you understand and work with and implement those measures that you have in place. Having a proactive health and safety culture will always go a long way when it comes to ensuring that you're doing the best and doing right by your employees. Having accountability at all levels is really important. So not only at senior management level, but ensuring that employees are taking responsibility and accountability for doing what they can to limit the transmission risk. Review documents and policies, risk assessments, as I say, take the government guidance into account, but to review your policies and practices and make individuals hostage to fortune. I think what I'd finally say is making sure that you've got an incident response protocol. So if the unfortunate did happen, you did have an employee or a person, another relevant person who's in your business contracting the virus or suspected contraction of the virus, you have to have a protocol in place. And to be honest, I don't really mind what that looks
for all I care, but as long as you've got something that shows the business stands what to do in the first 24 to 48 hours after exposure to a risk like COVID-19, and how you communicate the information to the staff, how you communicate with third parties, such as the press, such as a claimant who wants to make a claim, because we're not just talking about being sued for potentially being exposed to risk, but it's also the criminal side of it.
What I focus on is very much around what's our criminal liability. Can we be prosecuted by the health and safety executive for our failure to manage health and safety? And nobody wants to be in that position. So I think with that whistle-stop tour through all the risks that could come about from our experience with COVID-19, I think the best thing to do is to learn from people in the sector, do things like this, talk to local businesses, see what your compadres might be doing, discuss these issues and learn from each other. And I think keep the collaboration and the communication going, because at the end of the day, no matter what level we're at, no matter what level of accountability we hold, we're all in this together.
Thank you very much, Izzy. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. There's one from Richard Hodgson. I understand that COVID-19 became a notifiable disease on the 5th of March, and he was under the impression that any suspected outbreak needed to be notified to Public Health England and should be notified before any laboratory tests have come back.
Well, it's not a requirement, riddle, which is to the HSE, to Public Health England, yes, and it's a suspect outbreak, because that's got other implications. Sorry, I think it's just my car keeps automatically changing it to a different provider. The regulations to report to the Health and Safety Executive are slightly different in that they deal with actual cases or suspected exposure to risk, but where there has been a medical diagnosis or a fatality or an exposure to the virus by way of an inadvertent exposure. It's not generally dealing with mass outbreaks. If you feel that there has been a COVID outbreak, then you can see why that becomes much more important to report to Public Health England, because it has much wider implications. The regulations, the RIDDLE regulations, deal with specific instances that you have to report to the Health and Safety Executive.
Brilliant. We have one more question, and it's around, do employees have the rights under the Employment Rights Act to refuse work in circumstances they consider to be dangerous, especially around the virus?
Law actually, from what I understand from my employment colleagues, is very much on the side of the employee. If they feel that their health
may be at risk if they were to return to work, then they have absolutely the right to refuse. This is where this idea of communication and collaboration, I think, helps the employer, because you're less likely to get businesses having to face those type of responses from employees if they simply say, these are the measures that we have in place or we're planning to implement to secure the safety of our employees. This is what we plan to do. We'd like you to be a part of that. You are very much a part of this process. Tell us if you have concerns, and if we have concerns, then we will try to address them. And you're just less likely to get employees refusing to come back to work if you've got reasonable measures in place, and that will actually stand in good stead as your response to any sort of claim that you have failed to look after the health of your employees.
That's lovely, Kizzy. That was really, really informative. It's a shame about the couple of breaks, but I think you picked up really well, and I think it gives us a great example of, you know, how we have to adapt when we're working from home, dealing with kids, dealing with noise, dealing with connections. But the main thing is really, you know, becoming really familiar with these things so that it becomes second nature to actually switch to something else. And I think you demonstrated that really well, Kizzy. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Lots of questions.
It's time.
And one in particular, perhaps you could answer later, is around, is there a good template for risk assessment? If you could think about that one. For now,
yeah.
I'll just remind everyone that a couple of weeks ago we had Neil Campbell from Risk Dashboard, and Neil was talking about a software risk platform where you can assess your risks and also access templates. So if you haven't got an H&S policy, you can access the templates on that, and it is free. And I will send that link out again when we send out the recording. So thank you, Kizzy. Now I'd like to ask David Mellard from Bedrock HR to just talk about some of the practical steps to help businesses back into work. David, over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Kizzy. I learned a lot from your presentation. So many professional advisors have written about the legal obligations around social distancing or the furlough scheme. So instead, I want to share my thoughts about what employers and employees maybe have on their minds at this time, using an illustrative case based on our experience of supporting different clients. You may be contending with some of the concerns that are identified in this case study. So Chloe is MD of Stay On Site, a website development business in Battersea. She has 20 employees, including Paula and Josh, who are referred to in a short while. There's been a 40% reduction in orders for their business over the last 2 months, impacting revenue. This is likely to affect the company for at least the next 12 months. 5 staff have been furloughed, everyone else has been working from home. Senior colleagues are keen to get everyone back to the office. They feel that although work has continued, productivity and cohesion has suffered during the lockdown. Chloe is not certain and has the following concerns. What do the team think about returning to work? Can the workspace be set up to comply with social distancing rules? What should the size and shape of the team be now? How can she retain good people? When and if people should return from furlough? How can the business exceed customer expectations and ensure brand loyalty and upselling of services? How long will the cash last, as she's waiting on the outcome of a bounce back loan application? Paula is the finance manager and has been working from home in Surbiton, where she lives with her 2 teenagers. Paula has the following concerns about returning to the office. She's been supervising school online. There is no fixed date for school to return. She cares for her elderly parents who live locally. She doesn't want to get back on the train at present, certainly at rush hour, although the journey to Clapham Junction is relatively easy. Paula does her job well from home and doesn't feel the need to be in the office. After lockdown, if it is lifted, Paula wants to come into the office maybe 1 day a week. On the other hand, Josh is a client development manager and shares a flat in Clapham with 2 others. Sharing broadband and physical space is a challenge. Josh has been thinking about his job security and misses the office energy and has the following concerns. He's been working while flatmates are furloughed and act like every day is the weekend. He needs the commission he earns on sales to make ends meet, and no sales are being made. He cycles everywhere and getting to work is easy for him. He really misses the social side of work, and he feels the virus threat has largely passed and is angry at the restrictions. So what did Bedrock do to help Chloe? Well, we conducted a Zoom-based survey to find out the feelings of the team about returning to the office, travel to work, and social distancing and other aspects of health and safety, as well as how people are coping with working remotely and their own mental health. We qualified Chloe's options for reducing headcount cost, including redundancy, continued use of furlough, and reducing hours for some staff. We created a plan with Chloe determining who should return to the office, including assessment of the effectiveness and risks. We planned an activity that was fun and motivational to keep everybody engaged. And what was the result? There's now a fully scaled plan that Chloe believes will work. Chloe is clear on how the team feels and is going through a comprehensive staff review and a strategic review of how the team can build even better relationships with customers. You can read that article that I've read from in this month's Connections magazine. So Bedrock have been supporting charities, professional practices and scale-up businesses within the borough and beyond during this time. And many are now, as other speakers have alluded to, weighing up options for where work can be carried out from an office, from shared workspaces, and we have some good ones in the borough. I use Le Bureau, or at home. The size of team needed now and the options for saving costs is an area that we're in discussions with all the time with various businesses in different sectors. Sadly, redundancy, especially as the furlough scheme becomes less generous and ends in October, means that redundancy becomes more of an issue. And I'm meeting Martin Pocock this afternoon, who's on this call, to discuss how best to support businesses that need to close to ensure that legal risk is minimised relating to redundancy at that time. I have put my details in the chat box, and now I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
That's lovely, David. Thank you very much for that. We'll take the Q&As in just a moment. And Steve from Safety Delivery has asked me to point in the direction of the chat box where he has a free resource and a full checklist for developing risk assessments. So Steve's details are on there, and I'll get Steve to talk about that when we go into the Q&A session. So thank you, David. That was really useful to just get the practical side and to see an example. And yeah, we'll come back to you with Q&As in just a moment. Now, I know we've had quite a few speakers today, but I just want to introduce you to Dexter Moscow, who's going to be talking about a workshop that we're putting on together next Thursday at 11 o'clock. And it's really about how you can get the most out of Zoom. We all appreciate that the world is going digital now, and it's really important to be an expert in your own right and to be able to project your business and to engage with people. And Zoom and other similar platforms seem to be the way to go. So with that, I'm going to ask Dexter to just give you an introduction to what we're going to be discussing next week. Dexter, over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you very much for inviting me for this call. It's been fascinating and interesting listening to the other speakers. And what Kizzy has said, I really reinforce that what's happening over this next period of time, and perhaps for some time forward, is that we are going to be remotely conferencing and remotely speaking to people. So what I hope will be beneficial is what's going to happen next Thursday. And that is to discuss how we maximize our video conferencing and video presentation. and creation. And it's not just about chatting, it's about chatting with a purpose. And I'm going to use this word now, how we sell ourselves and how we sell our proposition. So very briefly, I'm going to cover 3 areas which are essential to get our message across effectively. So I'm going to be talking about what equipment we can use. What is the content? What's the compelling content that we can create? And I was very interested to listen to David, because he gave a presentation about not what he does, but what he did for others. And if there's one tip that I would give you, think about the stories that you can tell, which illustrate how you have helped others, because that's the key to promoting what you do. And the last element will be about delivery. How do we effective delivery in this environment? What right do I have to tell you about this? Well, for many years, I worked with QVC, the shopping channel, selling through a television screen. And we are actually all now in a televisual era. One last thing, if you have a particular problem that you'd like to discuss, then what I will do is I'll put my email address in the chat box, which will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. This won't be a lecture next week. This will be a discussion. It will be very interactive because it's going to be relevant to you and how I can help you. So thank you, Steve, for giving me the opportunity of suggesting what we will do next week.
Thank you very much, Dexter. I really look forward to that. Dexter actually came to a physical networking event about, oh gosh, must be 4 or 5 years ago, up at Battersea Reach, and gave an amazing presentation. He's also the sort of pin-up boy for QVC for many years, author and coach, and I'm sure we'll all find that extremely interesting. And again, we'll record that and it will be available. So now we're moving on to the Q&A session. I know this has been a long session, but if anyone's got a question they'd like to pose, can I ask you to click on the raise your hand button, and we'll come to you directly. Steve from Safety Delivery, would you like to come on and just tell us about the risk checklist that you have?
Right, am I unmuted, Steve?
You are, Steve, yes.
Okay, good, and hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you everybody for presenting, and once again Kizzy as well, a very good presentation. I don't think I can compete with her on the deep legal aspects, but certainly I can sort of give you just a little brief idea of what I'm doing, because in terms of risk assessment, as Izzy says, you do have to have a specific risk assessment on the COVID-19. So what I'm doing is initially to provide a checklist for people so they can go through. And it's based on, first of all, the government advice, because you can go online and you can see what the advice is in specific sectors. So that includes the office, going back to the office, going back to construction sites. So I've done specifics there, and that will enable people to really go through and see, are we doing, first of all, what the government guidance is saying? And secondly, it's more than government guidance, of course. Risk assessment is about exactly that. It's been around a long time before government had given guidance on it. So what we need to do is then secondly look at what is required in risk assessments per se. So that I'm hoping that that will give people a very good idea based on both requirements under what is simply guidance from the government, which is expected to be followed anyway, but also the law. So as Izzy has pointed out, lots of legal aspects, the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Managing of Health and Safety at Work regulations, and so on and so on. The other aspect that's not been mentioned, so I will bring that one up as well, and David might have a view on this one, but as well as providing risk assessments for my clients, and I have had a number of requested these. I've also looked at the personal risk assessments, because I'm also speaking to clients' own employees, particularly with regard to how comfortable they are in returning to the workplace, because that has to be taken into consideration. So I'm also doing personal risk assessments, which give an indication to the employers as to whether their staff, first of all, are comfortable going back, and also it gives an opportunity for employers to meet their obligations to consult with their employees. So it's also part of that consultation process. So employees can point out where they believe things may be a bit better in terms of going back to work, and the conditions that are set out for them, the changes that are made, and of course for those who are working from home still and continue to do so, whether their welfare and well-being in terms of working from home are also being looked after. So a few things to discuss there. So maybe Kizzy and David and anybody else would like to comment further on those.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Steve. Kizzy, one of the questions in the chat box, and following on from what Steve was saying, are there any risk assessment templates that you can recommend or talk about, as well as ones we've talked about?
There are a number of risk assessments out there. I'd always say, without obviously wanting to promote any particular provider, but there are a number of assessments that are out there that are pretty good. Obviously, I'd always say your starting point probably should be, do what the enforcers tell you to do, which is have a look on the HSE website and see what at least the sections are that they're looking at in terms of what should be covered. I would again say look at sector-led risk assessors, because there are lots of consultants that are offering the service, at least assisting you with pulling together a specific risk assessment, particularly for COVID-19. I think you have to choose on the basis of competency, and by that I mean not just the accreditation that they have, but also for your sector. Again, if you start to look at the type of risk assessments that you are providing or preparing, once you say we have looked for consultancy advice in our or with this particular company because they are experienced in the type of work we do, whether or not your risk assessment covers everything it needs to actually won't matter too much. The fact is you'll be able to show the HSE that you have tried to comply with your responsibilities under the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations by seeking the right risk assessors and the risk assessment document for you. So that, I think, is probably the best advice I can give. There are lots of providers out there. There's lots of advice out there on how to prepare a good risk assessment, but just remember, it's got to be suitable activities. It's got to be sufficient to deal with the risks for the people that work with you and for you. And you have to look at competency as a major factor of where you get your advice from.
Thank you, Kizzy. That's really helpful. Skin of Love, you've got your hand raised. I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
Good afternoon. It wasn't so much just a question as it's more just the general sort of recognition of obviously what we've been through over the last two and a half months, approaching 3 months. One of the things I see is going to be very important to bring people back out into the wider commercial sphere is basically just trying to convey confidence. Obviously, for somewhere like Tooting Market at the moment, people still can't sit down in the communal areas, eat, etc., stuff like that. So once the government gives the lifting of those restrictions, what is it that we can do, perhaps with the Chamber of Commerce and the borough, to promote the idea that as a borough, we are back in the full swing of things, and to obviously social distancing at some point, that distance might be reduced. Now, the type of experiences that we're obviously all experiencing walking down the high street, some people wear masks, some people don't wear masks. Some people wear gloves, some people don't wear gloves. You have a situation where some people don't worry about passing along a pavement, that I've equally had situations where I've seen people step out into the high street to try and avoid the passing too close to somebody, and the next minute they're walking into traffic potentially. So I think a lot of it will be about how shopkeepers and other businesses can actually demonstrate a confidence and a relaxed attitude to then try and get more and more people to get back into that whole mode of being relaxed. We're all on defensive mode at the moment. So it'd be interesting to see what ideas we could come up with, some sort of promotional, get people back into utilising the streets and utilising like the street like benches that may be around, etc., things like that.
Thank you very much for that. You're absolutely right. It's something that Paul Martin touched upon when he said it was so important to reinstall a sense of confidence, to let people know that it is safe to return and to go out. I think, you know, one thing that we can do as leaders really is to lead by example. The demonstrations have made us all question, you know, the sort of the validity of social distancing against deeper felt beliefs about supporting the campaigns. And that's really important, but there is no answer really. You know, emotions rule at the moment. I think in everything, whenever you're doing anything for businesses, you have to think about the emotions that people are going through, whether it's your employees or your customers. And if you can lead by example as a business, and it's something that we're asking businesses to do. I know it's something that's very high on the council agenda. They're talking about repurposing roads, repurposing streets to make sure that we can social distance. It is going to, I think Paul Martin was absolutely correct. There is no simple solution. It's going to be a long process and we have to work together. But equally, I think it comes down to leadership. I don't think there's a lot more that you can say apart from as a business, be one of the leaders and just lead by example. You know, if someone isn't social distancing, don't be afraid to ask them to just keep a distance, especially if they're in your premises. If you can help by providing face masks, sanitizers, then that all helps. Richard Hodson, is there any update for us on the insurance platform?
No. Some claims of boards, but not a huge difference from last week. Although I kind of just thought that Kizzy's presentation was very good. And just to reiterate what she said in there is that businesses have obligations to make businesses safe, but the individual obligations also are very important. And I think I said this last week, a company's liability is limited, but an individual's liability is not limited. So if somebody was to bring an HSE case against an individual, you have unlimited liability. So this is very important to make sure you have your directors and officers insurance in place right now to do that. So you do have, Kizzy was absolutely right about individual roles and obligations. If you are a director, it can, HSE can come out after you as an individual. So make sure your DNA is directors and officers is in place. It's very important. I think there'll be lots of claims coming out of this as well.
Okay, that's lovely.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow on from what Richard said. I think he's right that there probably will be quite a few claims coming in due course. There's also been a push by the HSE to look at individual accountability as opposed to corporate responsibility. As Richard said, it's limited. There probably are purse strings to be able to deal with a fine, but they want more accountability, and that's across the board in health and safety. They want more individual, more senior accountability. So they are looking at boards, they are looking at directors, and they are looking at senior managers and even middle management in some cases.
Thank you very much, Kizzy. We have a question from Jane Harries to Paul Martin, really, but Paul's had to leave. And the question is, what is the council doing to improve internet connections in the borough? Well, I think I can possibly help with that a little bit, Jane. Last year we did a large campaign with Community Fibre, and Community Fibre have been running a programme with Wandsworth Council to bring up to 100 megabits per second of broadband speed into the borough. and when it was rolled out to businesses, it was at very little cost, and the price compared very much to domestic prices. So look up Community Fibre. Wandsworth Council are working on this, as are a lot of councils at the moment. It's more relevant now, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more action on that shortly. Do we have any more questions? Because I know this has been a long session, but I think it's probably been extremely useful and very informative. So I'm not going to try and prolong it. I just ask our speakers to just make a final comment before they go. So Kizzy, would you like to say a last few words first?
Last few words, as I say, be proactive, have a preventative and robust approach, and seek collaboration from all. That's probably your best bet to push away the knock at the door from the health and safety executive, or in fact any other regulator who might be concerned with COVID-19, and seek professional advice, of course, from lawyers.
Thank you, Kizzy. David, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I think the thing that comes out of all this for me and experience over a period of time is speaking to your teams, speaking to your staff. And if you feel that you're not necessarily going to get the right or get an honest answer from them, then work out ways of getting information from them that doesn't involve you asking directly. But when you get information back from your team about how they're feeling, use that to make decisions about your business and how best you can operate and where from, etc. Because if you have your team with you, then you're a long way down the road towards making a successful transformation into whatever happens going forward.
Thank you, David. It really re-emphasizes what Kizzy was saying, you know, consult and collaborate. Don't just assume that you know all the answers. If you don't ask questions, you just don't know what you don't know. So consultation's a huge benefit. I think Steve Diamond is still on another conference call. Yeah. So Graham Russell, did you want to have a last few words?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Just to reiterate that all the grant schemes are still open. So if you do know of anybody who you think is eligible, please encourage them to go to the website on the discretionary scheme. You've put the link round, so thanks very much for that. Just a reminder that the discretionary scheme is time limited up until the 18th. So please get your applications in as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Brilliant. And Martin Pocock, you haven't spoken today, but you're on our panel. Are there anything new that's happening out there?
No, but I think the main thing that's come today is basically businesses should seek advice, because there's lots of people within the chamber who are giving talks. And I think if you've got any issues, the thing I will always say to people is seek advice early. You know, if you've got, you know, staffing problems, you're going to have to make redundancies. There's two, you know, employee consultants, there's employment lawyers at Russell Cook. There's, you know, just take advice. Directors, I think, sort of sometimes hide and they just don't take advice quickly enough, especially in my area of insolvency, where they put money into businesses that they should never have put money into, that, you know, basically wasted money. So the key for all directors, especially with public, you know, personal liability, is just seek advice. You know, go on the chamber website, look to see who's recommended by the chamber, and just take advice from those people.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Martin. Dexter, would you like to say anything finally in closing?
Yes, I just would love to see you at our next meeting. As I said, it's going to be highly interactive. And in this time of frustration and concern, remember that you can still reach out. Don't drop forward, reach out, tell your stories of your successes, and people will want to do business with you.
Thank you very much, Dexter. So I'm going to close this 11th Business Forum. Thank everyone for attending. Next week, we're going to be looking at mental health issues and how businesses can best just learn from everyone else really, and how to address these issues. I think for me, we are coming into sort of an emotional age. Emotions are very high. We're living on our emotions at the moment, and how we manage these and manage the stresses that are coming into our lives is really, really important. So I look forward to that one, and I look forward to seeing you next week. So thank you very much for attending, and please stay safe.